Hi, everybody. I'm Rufus Gifford, Senior Advisor to Out Leadership, and thank you so much for joining us on, I think, what is our fourth installment of This Week in Leadership. And this week, we're going to be focusing on journalism in the era of COVID-19. And we have with us a prominent LGBT journalist who will talk about, who's also had the remarkable experience that very few people have had, which is as he's a member of the White House Correspondents Association, so he actually goes to the White House and questions and attends the briefings with with President Trump several times, and has had the opportunity to ask him questions. So just really curious about what it is like to be a journalist, and in particular an LGBT journalist in the time of COVID-19. But before we do that, a few announcements. First of all, some shout outs. First, to City, one of our founding members. Thank you all so much. I think there's several people on the call from many of our firms, and we thank so many of them. So City, EY, HSBC, RBC Capital Markets, KPMG, Ropes and Gray, Nomura, Greenberg Traurig, and Capital One. Thank you all so much. And also just want to acknowledge some of the upcoming vodcasts, what we call vodcasts, over the course of the next several days and next week. Tomorrow, there'll be a leadership lounge with Todd Sears on mentoring. Next Wednesday, there'll be a leadership committee meeting. Check your emails for this. There are two different times for the LC meeting. So I think there's one in the morning and one in the evening. So that'll be on Wednesday. And Fabrice is going to be doing an equality imperative regarding elder care and COVID. So stay tuned for all of that. There's got a lot of interesting content ahead of us. So, but let's get to our program for today. And I've got a bunch of questions for our guest, but as always, it's more fun if this is interactive in some ways. You have the little question panel over to, I think, what is on the right of your screen. So if you do have a question, please type it in, and I will get to it over the course of our half hour or so conversation. And with that, I'm going to introduce Chris Johnson. So let me be first to say that in my previous lines of work in working for President Obama, Chris has interviewed me a number of times. So now the tables are turned, and I actually get to interview Chris. So Chris is the White House is a White House reporter and political reporter for the Washington Blade, one of the, I think, is it the largest daily LGBT newspaper in the country?
The oldest LGBT newspaper since 1969.
1969, oldest LGBT newspaper in the country, and so as I opened with, Chris, he's a native of Michigan, and went to the University of Michigan, moved to DC, and started his career in journalism. As I said, is one of very unique people. I think a lot of us out there see. At least I don't watch it every day. It's too much for me. But the president's daily briefings with the COVID task force, and Chris, because he's a member of the White House Correspondents Association, is sort of on a rotating cycle, and has been in the room a number of different times. And the first thing I want to ask you, Chris, so as one of the few people who are in that room, please just tell us what it's like. First of all, how do you get there? And how often are you there? And what's it like being a journalist in that setting?
Well, let me start with what it's like. I would just start off by saying that for me, it's actually quite an intense, experience. I mean, you have an opportunity once you are able to ask questions of the President of the United States, but at the same time, you have to make sure they are good questions, and so it takes a lot of thought process in order to come up with what would be a question that would be produce a newsworthy answer from the president. And then there's, on top of that, you have to deal with making yourself visible. There's competition among other reporters in a sense, because when the president is like picking up people to call on, then you have to be able to make sure that you are visible at the same time, you paying attention, and then there might be something that he might say, and then you might want to follow up on. You might want to change course of what you're going to do. So you might have to, shoot from the hip a little bit, depending on what the president says in a situation. And
Sure.
For President Trump, I mean, he has a history of a penchant, if you will, for being hostile with reporters. I mean, you might ask a question, you might have to be going to single combat with the president of the United States to get an answer to your question, and if you rub them the wrong way. So and then And and then on top of that, like you you risk the wrath of social media if you give it up if you have an exchange that displeases so many people. I had a Twitter mob this week of 3,000 Trump supporters come after me, and all I did was post a image of me at the White House. That was just about it. I'm not sure what they were so indignant about. But I mean, at the same time, it's very rewarding. I mean, this is, as you said, I'm one of the very few people who was able to ask the president of the United States questions during a time of an unprecedented pandemic. This is just such a tremendous opportunity that I've been given, and I'm very thankful for that. I do want to give specific props to the White House Correspondents Association. That kind of gets to the question of how I'm able to do that, because first of all, I couldn't even be in the White House premises if I had my hard pass without the association. If you may have saw some news a while back that they really restricted access to which journalists can get in and out, and basically made it so that unless you're like there every day, you won't be able to get a hard pass. And so the association was able to negotiate it so that every outlet that participates in the White House pool rotation, of which the Washington Blade does, will get one person with a hard pass. So I was able to get a hard pass thanks to their negotiating efforts, and then even by the fact that me getting into the press conferences, the briefing was a lot more thinned out now. There's more restrictions for social distancing during the coronavirus.
Yeah.
So they were able to offer me a rotating seat with the rotation. They just said, "Do you want to have a seat?" And because they offered it to me, and I definitely scooped it up because it was such a great opportunity.
Yeah.
So I mean, I get a lot of thanks to the White House Correspondents Association for making sure that the Blade's voice is present during these briefings.
And this is something I know that you essentially reported on all 8 years of the Obama administration. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, from the very beginning, even the 2008 campaign. So there's 8 years plus.
Yeah.
So,
and so you've been it's fair to say that you've been in the White House briefing room and maybe in the Rose Garden multiple times. And talk to us about sort of how the experience of being there has changed over the course. And even so, not even just from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, but even over the course of the 3 years in the Trump administration. Obviously, we haven't seen an actual press brief from the press secretary, and I don't know how long it's been, a year or so. And so what's it like? I mean, we have a president who I think wants to be his own press secretary in many ways.
Yeah, I think that's definitely his MO, is to make it. He's the person who wants to be answering the questions, being visible to the press. I mean, if you think back to the Obama administration, the White House press secretaries were the most visible on-camera components of the administration, taking questions from the press. It feels almost. I mean, they would be holding daily briefings, regularly. I remember some criticism when they would held them. They would miss too many days, and there was some criticism in the press for them not doing that. And then President Obama would kind of break things up every once in a while and held like a joint news conference, usually in the evening, with the press for certain occasions. And I do remember there was actually a lot of complaints that among the press that he was doing that too infrequently. But there was a lot more. The idea of the White House press secretary holding these briefings it's almost like a beltway tradition, and there was a lot of keeping with that beltway tradition going through the Obama administration. Trump completely upended that. I mean, it started off with Sean Spicer and Sarah Sanders, and they were giving briefings, and then Sarah Sanders, when they started gradually scaling them back, like once a week, and then once a month, and then they just vanished entirely. And for a long time before the coronavirus, the president kind of replaced that with him answering questions during departures before he would go someplace throughout the country. Then before he would board Marine One, he would have a gaggle with reporters, and he would take questions from whichever reporter he chose. And it was kind of these survival of the fittest gaggles, because you're not in a room or anything or seated. You're kind of trying to joust yourself into position ahead of a rope line, so the president sees you, and you have to, make sure that that you are visible. And now that said, I mean, the president was making himself regularly available. The president of the United States himself making himself regularly available to the press, which I have to say, a lot of people did appreciate. And so, but at the same time, the press briefings for the press secretary vanished. Stephanie Grissom didn't give one press briefing, as we all know. So now we're in the situation where the president himself is holding these daily press briefings because he's not traveling anywhere, so he can't do those gaggles anymore amid the coronavirus crisis, and that has its own. I mean, Trump is making himself available, but let's face it, that's inspired its own criticism too. And people are thinking that these briefings are too rally-like, that he's using it to maul reporters and he's giving out information that seems to be not true later on. He makes these announcements of things he's going to do that just don't pan out. If you remember, I think it was a month ago, several weeks ago, we're going to have this national website for coronavirus testing. And many of the officials, it was this huge Rose Garden news conference for that, and sure. That website never materialized. There's one website that's up that kind of does that for like the Bay Area and California. That's about it. But the president of the United States is holding daily press conferences, which is something we haven't seen in a long time. But it's very different from kind of the Beltway tradition that we've seen during the Obama administration.
Sure. Or really any administration. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration behaves in a way, love it or hate it, in a way that we have not seen in politics and government in a very, very long time.
Definitely. It's just completely upends a lot of things.
It's
always in one. Press access is chief of many among other things.
Yeah. So let's talk about sort of how you communicate. So your audience is an LGBT audience, right? Almost exclusively.
That's what I'm
as you're sitting there, excuse me?
That's whom I'm addressing, an LGBT audience when I write for the Washington Blade.
Yes.
The Blade. Yes.
So as you're trying to tell a story, as a journalist, as a political journalist, during the time of COVID-19, how are you thinking about communicating with the LGBT audience? Is it special? I've heard some of the questions that you've asked during the White House press briefing. I heard you ask him about, say, the blood ban on donations for gay men and how it's been revised a bit. I'm still not able to give, so it hasn't been revised as enough for me as far as I'm concerned. But and I think you asked another question even just yesterday or the day before about how COVID is disproportionately impacting the African American community. So talk to us about how your thought process is when you're thinking about your audience and writing for your audience. How do you think about the kinds of questions that you want to ask? What do LGBT readers, what does your data tell you? What do LGBT readers want to hear? Do they want to hear data specific to the LGBT community, or do they want to hear more broad information right now, or is it both?
Well, I think they want to hear both. I mean, LGBT people are uniquely situated for many different reasons. Government policies such as the gay blood ban, and so they have more of an interest in this information and what's going on with those policies than they would for a general audience. But then LGBT people are people too, as simple as that might seem. I mean, so they are having to deal with the massive unemployment. They're having to deal with the dangers of the coronavirus. They're having to deal with any other issue that the general population is facing as well. I just feel like my role, because other reporters in the briefing room can ask questions for more general audiences, is to ask more special for our unique audience. And the blood ban was a really good opportunity because it was
Can you actually, so for some of our listeners who may not know a thing about the blood ban, can you just actually talk about what happened and what you asked the president and what he said?
Okay, so the policy change was when the coronavirus crisis began, the Surgeon General began making this urgent plea for more blood donations. Now, the policy that was set by the FDA requires gay and men who have sex with men to be abstinent for 12 months, weeks ago before being able to donate. And there was a lot of, amid this, as the crisis was playing out, they were reviewing it, and then finally they said, okay, we're going to change the policy. Now you have to be abstinent for 3 months before you're able to donate blood. I'm not going to render any judgment for me on whether or not that policy is the value of that change. But the change was made. So the question remains, because here we are. This is definitely easing the blood ban for what it's worth. So you could argue that it's a pro-LGBT policy change that happened during the Trump administration. I just wanted to know, first of all, like, did the president have anything to do with that? I mean, this is something that he and I'm sure our readers wanted to know that as well, because a lot of it was a significant policy change for LGBT people. So that anyway, so I asked the president, "Did you have a hand in that change?" And it was a very short answer. He said, "No, I didn't know anything. It was up to the FDA, very capable people at the FDA," and then he moved on. So
Yeah.
he put some distance from between himself and that policy change.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. And it's something I know that, the vast majority of people don't understand that sexually active gay men are not able to donate blood legally, which is, that's a policy that's been in place since the 80s, right?
It has
been updated from
been
time.
updated over time. 1983, height of the AIDS epidemic. Gay men, you had sex once with another man, you were barred for life from making blood donations. The Obama administration, interestingly, like they actually visited it in the first term of the Obama administration. They didn't change anything. Second term of the administration rolled around, then they changed it to the 12-month deferral period, and then Trump administration, they changed it to the 3-month deferral period. I mean, you can get interested in a good debate as to what the best policy approach to this is. I mean, there are people who say that you might think that testing can just like find any sort of issues with the blood donation, and so being there shouldn't really be an issue as to who can donate. But others, that people who are more there are people who are more familiar with the issue who say that, well, the testing, it can be a window period where it might not be able to catch it if certain activity happens and you donate too soon. There needs to be some kind of window period. So
Sure.
this is something that's being debated and discussed, and what is fair and what is just and what is good for the blood supply as well.
Sure. Before we move on to other matters, one question we have from listeners: how can we better educate and communicate with healthcare providers? I think as a journalist, do you think about that? How do you separate fact from fiction? How do you communicate with healthcare providers? How do you tell your story as honestly as you can? Especially, I mean, I have questions about it. Generally speaking, we have. There's still so little known about COVID. The information comes at different times and is different messengers. How we have Birx and Fauci sometimes saying something different than Donald Trump does on the exact same stage at the exact same briefing. So how do we actually effectively communicate with people, especially if they're on the front lines, like healthcare workers and providers?
Well, that is a good question. I would just say that I don't know how equipped I am to answer. I'm mostly going in the opposite direction. Healthcare providers, health experts are providing me information, and I have to communicate that to my audience. I'm usually
That's
going
fair.
the opposite way. Now, I mean, on a rare occasion, I might have a news developer or a news story that I think might be of interest to healthcare providers. For example, I thought I was very interested in reading about this story I read a while back about the study in Spain that's ongoing right now, in which they are testing to see whether or not PrEP is actually effective in preventing COVID-19. This Spanish study is there's testing with a group of 4,000 medical workers, giving some of them PrEP, some of them placebo, some of them hydroxychloroquine, to determine whether or not what the infection rate is of COVID-19 as they go off and treat it in Spain, which of course is one of the countries most hard hit with the disease. So in that instance, I mean, I had a good story that actually interested healthcare providers. I remember getting emails back from healthcare experts saying that they had interest in this and they wanted to, provide. They wanted to have more information. And I really didn't have anything more to say than was in the story, but in that instance, I was able to write a story that was of interest to health providers. I mean, for the viewers' question, I just think it's just kind of key as to taking what they have to say and then making applicable to your audience. So, I mean, they might have like a general audience. You just have to kind of find some way in order to make the package that and make that effective for whom you are addressing.
But it's interesting. I had not heard about the study in Spain on PrEP. We haven't seen any results from that.
No, it just started very recently. I would say a few days ago, actually. It's supposed to be like a 3-month-long study. They're going to conclude it in June, and then it will. Then they're going to have another month for testing. So we're not going to know the results of that until probably early fall. But that study is ongoing a bit to see what's going to happen.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to, and again, if people have questions, feel free to type them, and I'll read them off as we go along. But then moving on to, I think, sort of the larger hat you wear, which is the political hat, and this is all sort of connected to COVID. So talk about how you can cover a presidential political race in 2020, and that will be your ultimate job, right? In 2020 will be to cover the race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. How do you think about that right now? How do you report on the larger presidential race when obviously Joe Biden is sitting at his home in Wilmington and can't interact with people, and the president of the United States has this massive audience every single day in the Rose Garden or the White House press briefing room, in the interest of journalistic fair time? How do you think about that?
That is
how do you report?
Unfair. I mean, that's just it is inherently unfair. President, like any incumbent president running for re-election, President Trump has a big advantage being the incumbent. I mean, he has the privilege of being at the White House, able to surround himself with healthcare officials, and he's got just the power of the presidency to, by doing his job, is inherently campaigning. Every incumbent president has gotten that. That's why incumbent presidents have the advantage in re-election campaigns historically. You just have to. I mean, Biden is in Wilmington. He has done video chat news conferences with reporters in that time. I've made myself available for them. On top of that, just the actual pandemic itself is absorbing so much of the oxygen.
Sure.
Most of the leaders right now want to have information on what's going on with the pandemic, and a lot of the information, the election in many respects has kind of just been secondary. And if a lot of the stories that I'll be writing probably right now would just be shouting in the wind if I were to write them, and if I didn't have any sort of consideration for the coronavirus epidemic, which is just changing everything and how we operate.
Sure.
It's really a challenge doing that, especially because I serve a specialty audience.
Yeah.
And I don't really have the best answer for that. It's very satisfying, but I am paying more attention to the coronavirus. The election has been sidelined in comparison to the coronavirus, and but I do also expect that to change sort of a bit as the election gets closer. I think that that's going to ramp up, and it'll be easier there'll be more to do with that than there will be with the coronavirus in the future, and that shouldn't be too far off.
Sure. I think like, for example, and I saw you wrote a piece yesterday about how Senator Tammy Baldwin endorsed Biden. From a reader standpoint, you probably see who reads what articles. I would imagine that people are still clicking on COVID stories a lot more than they're clicking on your sort of random political story that has actually not in any way connected to COVID. Is that fair?
I would say at this point in time, yes. There's just so much interest in COVID right now. People are very interested and concerned about the disease. So when they see news developments about that, that's what's getting the most attention. And the other thing is too is if you feel like you can, some of these COVID stories, like the Spanish story I just mentioned before, I was really adding to conversation, I think, a lot more with that story because no one was really reporting on that. Everyone knew about Tammy Baldwin's endorsement. That story didn't get that much traffic, but I thought it was definitely relevant for our readers because we have this high-profile LGBTQ person making an endorsement in the presidential race, and so that was definitely relevant to our readership. So, this kind of goes back to what I was saying before. COVID deserves the attention. People want to read about COVID, and so there's a lot more reader interest in that, and so there's a lot more writer interest in that as well.
Sure. So in thinking about one of the things I'm really interested in as you look sort of through the lens of 2020 and your audience, which is an LGBT audience, which are the people largely, I think, the people who are listening right now. How do you think about the LGBT community as sort of like a political voting bloc right now? And it's obviously the vast majority of LGBT people are by polling will tell you we'll vote Democrat, we'll vote for Joe Biden in November. But how do you communicate? Is there what's the role of LGBT journalism right now? Do you see our audience is growing or shrinking? Do you feel like your role is sort of more influential than it has been historically? Less influential? What's your sense of it as someone who's been around? I mean, now you've been around for more than a decade in this space.
All right, let me answer this question. It is both more and less influential at the same time. Let me explain that, because LGBT issues, interest in LGBT issues continue to grow. When the Blade was like I said, we've been around since 1969. We were doing this in the 70s or the 80s. Mainstream media had no interest in LGBT issues, pretty much. I mean, it was just seen as such a, for whatever reason, it was just not seen as maybe something to be talked. I mean, there's something that could be talked about in polite companies. So, and it'd be and when it did approach, and the rare instances in which the mainstream media did approach it, it'd be just kind of like holding it at an arm's length. But that has changed a lot, as we've seen so much advancements and acceptance in LGBT rights in recent years. And so, in one sense, that because there's more acceptance, there's also more interest, I think, and people are looking at LGBT issues, not just LGBTQ people, but just LGBT. The general audience is more interested in what's going on with the LGBT community. So I think there's like a lot more of a non-LGBTQ audience to be interested in seeing what's going on with our publication, what we're communicating to our readers, to get a sense of what's happening with the LGBT community. Sure. At the same token, at the same time, mainstream media is beginning to capitalize on this. I mean, before, I remember, like, if I wanted anything LGBT when I was growing up, I'd have to go to like a certain section in the video store where they had. I mean, that wasn't like nothing illicit. I'm just saying, like, if I want to watch Queer as Folk, I'd have to go to like this section of this video store, and like that it'd be very clandestine.
No, I remember. It's like if you wanted to go buy The Advocate or Out before, you had to go to the sketchier version, the sketchier parts of the magazine rack.
Right, and now I think that has really been fully embraced. I mean, like, they have various news organizations like NBC Out. They have NBC News has an entire platform to address LGBT issues, and so a lot of these mainstream outlets are now basically cashing in on our business, and because they have all this wealth from their general audience, that they provide a lot of competition for us, because they might be able to pump money into certain projects that we're not going to be able to pump into as a small publication. So small but sturdy publication. Mighty.
Yeah.
And and that's in a sense we're like we're more influential because I think more people are interested in what's going on with LGBT issues, but we're also striving to keep our influence because we're competing with other mainstream outlets now, many more outlets, and being a voice for the LGBT community.
Yeah. On a different topic, away from, I'm just going to read these questions as they come in, because they're away from COVID, and it makes me it's interesting that you'll get questions that are people are interested in, and not necessarily connected to COVID, which is interesting. So how do you analyze the shift in drag culture that is becoming meaner and based on shade than before? And two, what is your take on cancel culture that is polarizing the LGBTIQ conversation even more? Have you written about that? Actually, you may have over the course of your journalistic career recently. And if it's not your expertise, it's fine. I
have to be very careful with these questions. This isn't really my line of expertise, but I'd be happy to provide an answer. Let's start with number one. Drag culture is becoming meaner and based on shade than before. I'm not a drag aficionado. I go to a lot of events, and I mean, drag is a time-honored tradition in the gay community. I mean, like, when we go to like some sort of fundraising event, it would be like a drag queen is going to be the MC. I mean, that's just it's just a time-honored tradition. I have noticed that, like, it's just a lot of like I can see it. I see where the viewer is coming from, and there's like a mean quality to it. I think a lot of people like use like it can be kind of take this opportunity of drag to be bitchy and then have like a mask, so it's kind of like I avoid responsibility for it. I don't know if that has been changed since it was in earlier times. I always thought that was just kind of shade was just kind of a component of drag. But I do think that drag is also an art, as an art form. people, use that to artist. There's a lot of components to putting together an outfit, and it's not just like dressing in women's clothing. It has to be really ostentatious and really bold and really over the top and really eye catching. And so, I mean, there is a kind of a personal expression aspect to it that I think is still maintained, like since when drag has before going on since before my time, and it continues to this day. So
No, it's great. Honestly, and I think it's perfect, and it's just it's not your lane. I was just curious if whether or not political journalists rarely write about that. So it's
right.
but it's still
Drag is my audience though. Those the drag queens are the part of the LGBT community, so that is my
I
audience.
bet.
So I have to be thinking about them as people who tell my stories to me even when I'm addressing the president of the United States.
That's
So,
right. Honestly, without a doubt, and so and there are not very many people who actually think about that. So it's I'm grateful that I'm actually grateful that you're thinking about communicating when you are writing, that you're thinking about the fact that the entire community is part of your audience, probably less than what the other journalists at the White House press briefing room are thinking.
I would assume so. Yeah.
So you mentioned, say, I'm curious about like some of the stories that might be from COVID that are specific to the community. You mentioned the PrEP study out of Spain. Are there others that maybe I wasn't aware of that? I find that interesting, and I'd want to learn more about it. Is there anything else that maybe over the course of your writing and your research that you've come across that are specific to the LGBT community that just maybe areas of interest?
Well, one thing is like, of course, a question is like, are LGBT people being disproportionately affected by the virus? There are some wonderful, well, not wonderful. There is some good data coming out from the States showing that the Black population is disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. I mean, I don't have the exact numbers before me right now, but I remember seeing the data from Michigan, in which Black people make up like 15% of the population. But I think that the infection and mortality rates are like somewhere around are much higher than that. And so one story I did recently is whether or not states are collecting LGBT data on these COVID patients. And they are like almost to the T, they are not collecting this data. Even the bluer states like, California and New York and Washington State, they just aren't collecting this data. Washington State cited a reason of they feared it would be infringing on privacy rights if they were to ask people for about their LGBTQ status, which has some. I mean, I can't deny that it has some a valid argument. I can see where people might be uncomfortable with volunteering that to a medical practitioner who is an absolute stranger, especially if they're dealing with whatever, that having to volunteer information might be difficult, and asking about it might be cause an uncomfortable situation that might impede care. It's possible, but the story is basically states are not collecting this data, and a lot of LGBT advocates are not happy with this because they think that this would be able to, if we knew, for example, that there was a disproportionate number of transgender people who are afflicted with COVID-19, then people who are trying to thwart the disease could thwart the public messaging, so it would affect the transgender community a little more, and we have this data to back that up for funding to make sure about for why this public messaging would be necessary. So. That's kind of one of the major stories I've done with for how coronavirus is affecting LGBT people. The fact that states are just not collecting this data on the patients. And I think PrEP too is something that the LGBT community has adapted since the wonderful development of that drug and its distribution to people who are at risk of HIV, not just LGBT people in recent years. And so I'm just kind of keeping an eye on that. The Spain study is going to test that's going to test whether it has effective in preventing it is something I'm really keeping an eye on.
That'd be fascinating. Yeah. So they're not talking about it as a therapy. They're not talking about it as a therapeutic, or are they talking about it as a preventive?
The study they're talking about is prevention. They're giving it to these workers going out into the field and giving them PrEP and seeing if that is going to either prevent infection, or if they do get infected by it, it's going to lessen the severity of the infection. I'm not aware of PrEP as treatment. I had one doctor who was evaluating the study said that he was very skeptical of this study because PrEP is actually, when it was started, the medication was intended to treat HIV, and then it was found to be effective to prevent HIV. this study seems to skip that. It's not looking at whether it's going from not just treatment, but going straight to prevention. So we're kind of making kind of a big jump from one use of the drug to another. So
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
there remains to be seeing what's going to happen with it.
Yeah. Another question from a listener: given the current divided situation in the country and the use of the media to sometimes spread misinformation and thereby increase divisions, how do you believe the news media can get us on a more productive constructive path? What should our role as consumers of media be to improve the situation? I think that second part of the question I'm very interested in as well.
Okay, my personal advice to consumers of media is to be skeptical of everything. Be skeptical of everything you see, because it is one person who is trying. It is one person or group of people who is trying to get as a reason to get this piece of information for you. Be skeptical of me. Be skeptical of everything you see on TV. I'm a big believer in skepticism, and just kind of like and you have to. I mean, at the same time, these institutions are trying to get information out, but they're not exactly like they want to like give context to it that would be, and the context they're giving to it is going to be in the minds of who's ever providing it. So I think that the consumers of the media, the onus is almost always is a great degree of this responsibility is on the consumers of media to be careful about what they are seeing, to be skeptical, to really assess that. I mean, that said, I mean, skepticism is not easy to do. I remember I heard a couple years back. I found a poll that they distributed like a news story, a fake news story, and a true news story from a popular outlet to this group of people, and 70% of the people could not tell the difference as to what was true and what was an actual news story and what was a fake news story. It was made up, even though that one was like seemed more official, one seemed to be made up. And I didn't have like a first time look at the story. I remember someone talking about that. So that's a really high number. That 70% of people cannot distinguish between a false news story and a real one. But I mean, disinformation has always come out against us from every different angles. I mean, like there'd be like rumors when it's not a new concept.
It's just easier to share now. It's easier to spread, right? Because of social media.
Spread now. Okay. I mean, there's more tools to spread. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
Fair
I think
enough.
word of mouth is also a time-honored way of spreading disinformation. We have had that since time immemorial. I mean, the media also has the people who have this platform, have platforms to speak out. They are bound to say what is the truth, and if they're not saying, that's just something they just have to keep an eye on. And if they're found that they are not providing that truth, if that can be proven that they are, there's a good case that they are not providing that information that is anything other than accurate, then they should face the appropriate consequences.
Sure. One of the things I continue to be challenged by in journalism, and I'm a huge believer in journalism, and I think actually you're doing God's work and being a journalist, especially at a time when journalism is under attack every single day, directly from the mouth of the president of the United States in particular. But it's also the difference between kind of editorial or editorializing, opinion writing, and journalism. And they're two completely different mediums. And I don't think that we have to understand that, Sean Hannity is not a journalist. Sean Hannity is an editorialist. He's an opinion writer. And to distinguish between, and you are a journalist, right? You are a neutral. That is your job, to be neutral. It is not Sean Hannity's job or Rachel Maddow's job to be neutral, right? Isn't that fair?
I agree with that as a premise, because and I say, to the detriment of journalism, I've seen that kind of fusing together a little bit more often. I mean, like, you see a lot of news stories that are supposed to be like news articles from writers who profess to be neutral, and then they include information that is clearly divulging what they think about the situation, that their own opinion within the article. And I just think that makes it more or less likely for the reader to accept what is happening. And honestly, when I'm not even quite sure why the reader would be interested in the writer's opinion, when it's supposed to be kind of a fact-based, or a piece about a news development or a news trend.
Sure.
There is definitely a convergence, and I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So in our just closing couple of minutes, let's just going back to the presidential race, and just obviously, hopefully there'll be a time very soon where we'll be pivoting from constant coverage of the health crisis to politics, and where you will focus. First of all, do you think that Joe Biden is, and I'm a Joe Biden endorser, as you know, do you believe Joe Biden is doing enough to appeal to the LGBT community? Do you think that the LGBT community will show up for him in November?
Well, I've heard no complaints whatsoever about Joe Biden not doing enough on LGBT issues. I mean, if he's been like, he put out a comprehensive LGBTQ plan that came out not too long ago, and it has everything on it from the Equality Act to he did address the blood ban, and then it even includes like issues that are intersectional, like the Dream Act. I mean, it was a pretty comprehensive plan. I mean, he's been making the rounds for these LGBT forums hosted by GLAAD and the Human Rights Campaign. He's spoken at the Human Rights Campaign's dinners. I mean, like, he has, been out there. But I haven't heard any complaints about that. And I have to say, though, that I think that's the fact that there's no complaints might be more of a reflection of the LGBT community these days, because I'm actually surprised there isn't much of more of a demand for him to do more. For example, I mean, like, if you remember back during the first years of the Obama administration, there was
I remember those.
Intense pressure to act on LGBT rights, to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell immediately. I mean, I would almost call the relationship hostile with President Obama during the first years. I'm just not really sensing that, with Biden. So I mean, I don't know what that means. I mean, is the LGBT community getting more complacent now that a lot of the major victories have been won, like Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal and marriage, and now there just we don't have the energy for it? Or I don't know, maybe after the election when things get switched around, then maybe that'll change. But
Sure.
I mean,
do you see any attempts on the part of Republicans or Trump to appeal to LGBT people?
Well, the word attempt is doing a lot of, and the emphasis is on attempt. If you could, like, for that Hydra, like, I would say like one of the heads is at least doing that. I mean, the other heads are doing their part to disrupt it. I mean, we had the Solicitor General of the United States arguing that it should be perfectly legal under the law to fire someone for being LGBTQ. You would not have gotten that in our Democratic administration. If those cases were for the Supreme Court now, and we had a Democratic president, I'm sure that would be the opposite case that they would be arguing. I mean, like, Rick Grenell is probably the chief person about this. He's had this initiative. I'm sure you're aware of it as someone who has worked in foreign policy, in which he has this initiative. He wants to try to decriminalize homosexuality, and I mean,
Rick Grenell is an openly gay, wearing two hats right now, which is very strange. He is still the U.S. ambassador to Germany, and now he is the acting DNI director, who's the director of national intelligence. He's openly gay.
Arguably the highest ranking openly gay presidential appointee in history, although I think you're kind of cheating a bit if you don't.
Fred Hochberg would take issues with you.
If you don't subject yourself to Senate confirmation, I think that's kind of cheating a bit. But
it's fair.
I mean, so he's got that. I mean, and you can see a lot. Like, I know, like, his press shop like tried to like really promote the blood ban as something that he's done for because the White House Deputy Press Secretary Judd Deere is openly gay. He makes no secret about that, and he tried to promote that as a initiative that was done for the change that was done for the blood ban as a change for gay men. I mean, like, it's really, they're making an attempt now. So whether or not this is going to change anything, I don't. I think that I think the proof is going to be in the pudding. First of all, when we get the numbers, the exit poll numbers, and this fall, I think a lot more people. I think I think people realize that the Democratic Party is going to be a lot more tried and true for LGBT issues than any sort of risks taking with the Republican Party. That has a lot. It's still dominated by groups like the Family Research Council. Still dominated groups by like Alliance Defending Freedom. Their legal group, but I mean, like, groups are like affiliated with those entities are still are very, very influential within the Republican Party.
Sure.
And we have Peter Thiel, who's like giving a lot of money to Donald Trump, but that's just one person. And
yeah, openly gay, founder of PayPal, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, great, Chris. Thank you. Listen, first of all, thank you. Any closing words? I'll say, I'll editorialize a little bit to say that, look, I think journalists are doing God's work, especially in this time, and trying to root out fact from fiction, especially at a time when you're being verbally accosted from the highest office in the land publicly. So I appreciate the work that you continue to do. So thank you. And also, I will say, I'll say this. I think that. That it's people need to support local journalism, and I consider LGBT journalism to be local journalism. And you mentioned sort of NBC Out. You mentioned, I know, like HuffPo has an LGBT, and that's all great. I'm not taking away any of that, but I say to everybody on the call, if you're still listening, that go read the local LGBT journalism. It's been around for years and years. It's unified our community for years and years, and let's make sure there's still an audience for it. I think it really does matter. So thanks for doing not just the work of journalism, but I think the critically important work of LGBT journalism too. I hope we all continue to read it. But any closing words beyond that?
Well, I just want to thank you, Rufus, for inviting me on. I mean, I thought this was a really good conversation. I just feel, I know that I feel very grateful to have this opportunity to, have this, being able to have the seat in the White House briefing room. I do my best to represent the LGBT community in the briefing room, to ask questions I think are relevant to our audience, and I'm grateful for you for the opportunity for me to talk about it. It's really important to me.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting for us to hear about it. So thank you. And just for those of you who are not on in the beginning, our upcoming vodcast, we have one tomorrow at noon with Todd on mentoring. We have a leadership committee meeting next Wednesday, another equality imperative vodcast with Fabrice next Wednesday on elder care and COVID. And next Thursday, there is a leadership lounge with Todd talking about purpose. So thank you all. Thank you all so much for listening. Chris, thank you so much for sharing 45 minutes or so of your day with us, and keep up the good work, and everyone enjoy your Thursday. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Rufus.
Thank you, Chris.